Hello. Today we'll talk about the execution gap. What is the execution gap? The execution gap is a pattern that I've noticed more and more when talking to large organizations, in particular large ones that are not inherently digital. Let's put it like this. And it's something that I think has a lot of impact on how effectively these organizations can execute on their digital and API plans. And I thought it might be worth sharing this with you. So today we'll talk about the execution gap, which is this problem between having certain goals and then the question of how do I execute on these goals. The reason why I've called it like this is just a brief anecdote. So this is me actually with a friend standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, and our goal, our vision, was to cross the Grand Canyon, to run to the other side and back. And there, it's kind of a similar problem to other, let's say, ambitious tasks. It's something that is achievable, but it's definitely not easy, and you want to minimize the risks, and you want to have a plan along the way. And only if you plan this carefully and in a strategic way, and you execute on it in a good way, then you can actually make it to the other side. And it's very similar with organizations. Just a brief story from my conversations with organizations. Oftentimes nowadays that there's an organization that has some kind of digital transformation language in their vision statement. They talk about digital transformation, digital capabilities, the opportunities of digital services, whatever it is. Oftentimes they even talk about APIs. So even in those vision statements, because no digital whatever can work without APIs. So it's kind of safe to mention APIs because we all know you will need APIs. So even APIs are in there. But then the next step then is that I ask them, okay, that makes sense. Now show me your API strategy. And this is where often there is a long and awkward silence, and then there is no strategy. And then you can really start asking questions and dig a little bit deeper. Okay, you have no strategy. So how do you think teams will even know that they have to build APIs, and why will they do it? And will teams build good APIs? Do you give them a definition of what a good API is, and do you help them to build good APIs? And will it be easy for teams to build APIs? Will you help them? Will you give them a platform? Will you give them tooling? Will you give them training? All these kind of things. And then even if you do have good APIs and teams are building them, do you make it easy for those APIs to be discovered and used throughout the organization? And all of these things, I think, don't just happen because you say, we're doing APIs from now on. It's really something where you need to have a strategy that makes sure that these things happen, and you need to go even further. Let's look into the things that I think are really necessary to successfully execute on things. How to get from this vision of we want digital transformation and we know that we need APIs to value really being delivered to the organization, where the organization can then say, yes, we're being more successful because this is the vision that we followed. And having the vision is important, but it's really just the end state where you say, I really would like to achieve this thing. So I would like to make it to the other side of the Grand Canyon, or I would like to be better at capturing digital opportunities. And that's good. You need that vision so that you have something to walk towards, so to speak. But then you also need a strategy, which is a plan how to actually get there. And that plan and the strategy should make it plausible how you can actually get to your goal by laying out steps that say, okay, and we think we can get there by doing this, and this. But that's not enough. Then you also need a program which executes on that plan. And that program then will start having certain processes along the way where you say, okay, if this happens, this is what we do, or this is what we know will happen. So there's a way how to deal with it, and we plan ahead of time because we know that we will encounter these kind of things. And that's one of the goals that you will have with such a program. And the other thing, a program will also give you indicators that tell you how well are things going. Are we doing well? Do we have problems? Should we readjust? How are things going, generally speaking? And you need all these things. If you're missing any of these, you're probably not moving effectively to where you want to be. And there's this great quote, which I really love, and I think it's very famous, from General Omar Bradley, which goes, "Amateurs study strategy, professionals study logistics." And the point here really is that what he's saying is it's good to have a good strategy, but you also need to be able to execute on it. If you're not making sure that your strategy is really getting executed, which takes a lot of grunt work, but it's necessary, then having a strategy really doesn't give you much because you won't be able to execute on it. And this really is, I think, underlying this execution gap a fair bit, that we see these high-level statements saying digital transformation, whatever, but when you then ask questions, and of course I just look at one specific segment, the API stuff, because that's where I work. But just looking at this, I look at it and I can tell organizations this is not going all too well. And if you want to achieve your end goal of better digital transformation, then you have to make sure that you also take care of the logistics of APIs. And since I have seen that in so many organizations, I thought it's worthwhile sharing that with you. So maybe you can also spot it in your organization and maybe then also readjust your expectations a little bit, or trying to work towards bridging that execution gap. And what are some indicators that maybe allow you to spot that execution gap in your organization? One is, I think, that there is no explicit API strategy. I think there should be one. There should be a plan how those APIs that you very clearly need for anything digital, how those APIs will come into existence. They won't just pop out of nowhere. You have to make sure they exist, and you have to make sure that they also are being planned in a good way, and that is the job of an API program. So even if you have a strategy but there's no program that talks about processes and indicators and how do we measure how well we're doing, how do we spot any places where we might be struggling so that we have to fix those things. So you also need an API program. If you don't have that, I think that's also a possible indicator for the execution gap. Another thing that I've noticed a lot is a funding model problem. So if you run into issues where you don't quite understand how an API program even would get funded, that's a warning sign, because that's a necessary foundation for digital transformation. And if there's no funding model around this, if the expectation is that this will somehow just appear as a side effect of other things, that is probably not going to happen. Somebody needs to own this problem. Somebody needs to make sure that this platform really comes into existence, and there needs to be a funding model around this. You need teams who provide tooling, who provide training, maybe, all these kind of things. And if there's no funding model, I think that's also a warning sign. And another warning sign, a little different from the others, but I think it's also something that's interesting to look at. If you have a lot of APIs and then people say, oh, we have a lot of APIs, so we're good, then look at those APIs and think about how many of those APIs have more than one consumer. Because if they don't, if they only have one consumer, I would argue they're not really APIs. They're just good old integration, technically done through APIs, but they're not providing this foundation of building blocks that you really want, where you say we build a capability and then we build it in such a way that it can be reused throughout the organization in different contexts for different customer experiences. And if that's not happening, if all your APIs are single serve APIs, that's a warning sign as well, in my mind, because clearly nobody is looking out that you get good APIs. And I think you need somebody looking out for that. And of course, I cannot give you the magic recipe to fix that. If I could, I would be, I think, an independent consultant and would get very rich by fixing this problem in all the organizations, and they would happily pay me a lot of money, because I think there is a lot of money being spent, or no, not being made, let's put it like this, because organizations are not approaching this in the most effective way. But what are 3 fixes that we could look at? One would be, and this is what I just said, one would be to always clearly point out that there is a lot of opportunity cost involved here, meaning that yes, you don't have to have an API strategy, you don't have to have an API program, but in the long run, you're paying way more if you're still running everything as classical integration projects, as something where everything has to be built end to end. And that's just not the way that you want to operate if you are serious about digital transformation. So the question then is really, is that opportunity cost something that somebody recognizes? Or is everybody just asking, how much does this project cost? And nobody's looking at this foundation that needs to be there at some point. Another fix that I think is important to look at is think about possible synergies. So look at the capabilities that have the highest potential of reuse within the organization, where you could say, look, if this capability was something we could easily use in those 3 applications and those different customer experiences, we could make customers much more happy, and that probably would be good for us as an organization. So the more you can point to these things, to these inefficiencies, to the inability to execute on certain customer experience things, I think the easier it becomes to understand that maybe we should fix that gap. And the last thing, which is a little bit more long-term, but I think a good starting point, is to really start a business API portfolio and to start collecting the APIs that you either have or that you should have, so that if people start asking, okay, now maybe we should have an API program and maybe you should have an API platform, what would be in there? Then you already have something and say, look, these are things where just by talking to people and looking at what happens, these are probably good areas to invest in, where we could start building first really business-aligned APIs. Okay, that's all that I wanted to talk about today. It's not that technical, this topic, but it's dear to my heart because I see it in so many organizations, and I see so many organizations struggling with it and not finding really a way out of it. And it still baffles me from time to time, because I am 100% convinced that many organizations are losing a lot of money. They're not losing it in terms of losing revenue, but I think they're losing it in terms of losing competitiveness, not realizing potential revenue, these kind of things. And I think if you see that happening in your organization, just don't think that is special. I think it's very normal, and we have a lot of organizations who are like that, in particular the more traditional ones, let's say it like this, not the digital ones. And if you see that happening, try to bridge the gap. And I think there's a lot of potential to be realized. It's a very interesting journey. It's a rewarding journey. So I wish you all the best. And with that was it for today. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. There's always something interesting in terms of APIs here. And I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.